There are a lot of things that I really value and like in Singaporean society, but they don't expect that every foreigner who comes and lives here wants to become a Singaporean.
Meet Joel, an Australian who's been living in Singapore for 9 years. He shared with me why socializing with locals can be challenging, what's wrong with all condos in Singapore, and why Singaporeans expect foreigners to leave rather than assimilate. I'm Max, an entrepreneur and YouTuber. Let's go.
Singapore doesn't expect foreigners to stay. So obviously, like, my wife is Singaporean. I got permanent residency after we got married. So some foreigners will become permanent residents. But in Australia, I had friends who came from India, who came from Iran, who came from China. And almost as soon as they arrived in Australia, people treat them as if, okay, you're a new Australian. Like, the Australians are almost offended if someone migrates to Australia and then leaves again. They're like, why would you come here and then go? Whereas in Singapore, the assumption is, oh, you're a foreigner. You'll stay for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then you'll go. So it's a very different assumption. In Australia or America, there are big debates about, should we ask people to assimilate into our culture? Singapore doesn't have that same debate in the same way. I mean, some people might complain that, like, particular groups don't speak good English or things like that. But by and large, the discussion is not like assimilation. They don't expect the British guy who is watching soccer at Clarke Quay to assimilate into Singaporean society. They're like, you'll come here, you'll work for 5 years, and then you'll go. And so I think in Singapore, if you want to come and hang out with people who watch rugby, everyone is English or South African, you can do that. If you want to come here and you want to hang out with people from Shanghai and complain that Singapore is too quiet and the food isn't as good as in China, then you can do that. So Singapore allows you to come here, live in your bubble, and then leave again. But actually, Singaporean society and culture is very rich.
You said rich in terms of what? In terms of money or in terms of, like, the culture?
I mean, definitely there is a lot of wealth in Singapore. But actually, I think when I talk about Singaporean society being rich, even if you take all the money away, Singapore has, in some ways, it is actually like Australia. Like, it's not like there was a Singaporean society 500 years ago. There were people who came here from Britain, India, China, Malaya, what is now Indonesia. They came here only about 200 years ago, and they established a new society. They have, within that society, they have traditions. There is a lot of people who are very learned, who are thinking very deeply about the world, not just how do we make money, but, we have Singaporean literature in multiple languages. You have, people like Adrian Pang who are writing plays. You have the guys at Wild Rice. So there are people who are thinking about the world. They're thinking about their place in the world. What does this mean? I think all of that will last when the money is gone. The education, the culture, the learning, the values, that's really what makes Singapore rich.
Yeah.
Not the money. And there are a lot of things that I really value and like in Singaporean society, but they don't expect that every foreigner who comes and lives here wants to become a Singaporean. If you want to come and be a foreigner and then go away again, they're okay with that.
Foreigners, they come to Singapore, they spend a lot of money for, let's say, like, for food. They go to, like, Clarke Quay, Boat Quay, like Sentosa, and, like, they spend, because some of the foreigners, they live in the bubble, so they don't want to go to hawker center. If they're here for, like, 4 years, 5 years, and then they go back, but they spend so much time, like, going to fancy restaurants. It's good for Singapore economy, I guess.
Singapore's economy, to a certain extent, is making Singapore a really attractive place for companies to do business and companies to bring highly skilled people to do business here. So, part of that is good taxes, but a lot of that is, good connections from the airport, good public transport, a safe place to live, a clean place to live. So we come here and we love it. But actually, like, that is the business model of Singapore. From a perspective of Singapore, our role is to provide employment and demand for the goods and services that Singaporeans produce. So, we have to pay rent, we have to buy food, go out, spend money. And it's the money that we spend that actually provides employment and all of that. And so I think that's a really interesting business model. Like, I think a lot of other countries are a lot more like, oh, foreigners come here and they take our jobs. But actually in Singapore, there are the foreigners from like Bangladesh and Philippines who come here who really their job is to come here and do the jobs that Singaporeans do not want to do. And then there are the foreigners who come who are like highly educated. They come from China, Japan, Australia, America, Europe. One of the interesting things is, if you look at who they hire, I think the people who they get to come here are not representative of the countries they come from.
For sure.
So the people who come here will be like people who were, maybe not in terms of wealth, but definitely in terms of education, they might be like top 2%, top 5% of the country they come from. And so they then come here and they do very sophisticated things. But then, you know, in the workplace, I think maybe some Singaporeans, the only foreigners they might see are like the ones they work with at a consulting firm or a bank. And so they think like, oh, the normal Australian is like this, or the normal Chinese person is like that. But actually the person who they're interacting with is actually from like a very narrow range of the society they come from.
Yeah.
Like I don't think you're a normal Russian necessarily. I always tell people I'm a bad Australian. People think, they think Australians, like they think, oh, you're from Melbourne. You'll like coffee. No, I don't like coffee. You'll like beer. No, I don't like beer. You'll follow sports. I don't follow sports. So I always tell people I'm a bad Australian. But Singapore is perfect for me because I don't have to be a good Australian here. I can just focus on the nerdy things that I'm good at and have my friends and live my life, and it's good.
I really like Joel's attitude towards life. I personally started feeling that I was truly living and enjoying my life when I became a full-time YouTuber. It's fun, it develops me as a person, and it pays the bills for a good life in Singapore. Guys, I want to share my knowledge with you, so you can also start, grow and monetize a YouTube channel. I'll soon be opening sign-ups for my SHIM Side Hustle YouTube Mastery Program. If you want to secure your spot with the best deal, click the link below and join the early bird list. See you on the other side, future YouTuber you.
What's the biggest difference, like let's say in lifestyle in Melbourne versus Singapore?
Singapore is obviously very efficient, and so obviously we all appreciate that. But I think also in Australia, the shops, like if you work during the day, you finish work and then the shops are closed at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Like late night shopping is like one night a week for most of the year. And then at Christmas, they make it like every night. And even then it might close at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously here in Singapore, like it's a real 24-hour city. So you can go out and do stuff, and not everything is open all the time, but it gives you much more of that 24-hour lifestyle, which, you know, when you're single and when you want to catch up with friends and you're working long hours, that's very fun. Actually, I mean, one thing that I loved in Melbourne is outside of London and New York, Melbourne is one of the greatest theatre cities in the English-speaking world, and a lot of, you know, big professional musicals, but also a lot of like community theatre and stuff. So I used to love that in Melbourne, and that's one of the things, like there are some good theatre companies in Singapore. So I like going to Wild Rice or SRT, but it's not the same. And in Singapore, almost everything is professional. It doesn't have that like community theatre kind of scene in the same way that it does in Australia.
Did you have any like difficulties to, let's say, socialize with Singaporeans when you just arrived?
I had friends in Melbourne who moved to Sydney for work.
Yeah.
And I had one friend who moved to Sydney, and after he's been there a year, I said to him, so how many of your friends are from Sydney? And he said, oh, none of them are from Sydney. I have friends from New Zealand, friends from Adelaide, friends from Perth, friends from South Africa. Because if you're in Sydney, it's a big city, you grew up there, you have your friends from school, your family, your friends from your job. Whereas if you move there from outside, you have no one, and all the locals already have a full social life. And then you turn up, and who is it who has empty space in their social life? It's other people who just arrived. So I think when I turned up, I was like, oh, I want to make an effort to get to know locals. But actually it was like, for a local, they'd be like, oh, let's make a time in 3 weeks to catch up. Whereas for my friends who are like also from Melbourne, it might be like, it's 6 p.m. on Friday. Okay, what are you doing later tonight? And so I found that actually other people who are like similar life stage to me, also don't have family and background in Singapore, were easier to build friendships with because they were just more available. But now I've been here 8 years, actually I feel like I'm more like the local.
Oh yeah?
So people come to Singapore and I think like, oh, like, you know, someone I know in Turkey sent me a message and he said, oh, my employee is moving to Singapore for work. You should connect with her. And when she first came, I was traveling with my wife overseas. When we came back, she was busy with something, then she was traveling. Then we made a time to catch up. Her baby got sick, so we cancelled. And then I messaged her and I said, oh, let's catch up. And she's like, actually, we're moving back. If I was new here, it would have been much quicker. I would have been like, okay, I'm free today, tomorrow, the day after. When can we do this? But now I'm here. It's like I have a busy life. I have work. I have commitments. And now it's like, okay, maybe in 2 weeks I have time to catch up. So I feel like once you've been here a while, you actually start to behave a bit more like a local. But when you first arrive, maybe you feel like, oh, locals are hard to get along with because like they always want to schedule a long way ahead. And it's very easy to, when you're the newcomer, to be like, oh, these people are maybe a bit snobbish or maybe a little bit like closed. But then actually, I think you just need to understand that they've been here forever. Yeah. They have a busy life already. And so, if you put in time, eventually you will have some local friends. But to expect that they have as much time for you as you have for them when you've just arrived and you have no commitments is a little bit unreasonable. So you have to be patient, and then over time you will get to know people. As
you mentioned, it's not only for Singapore.
Not only for Singapore.
For Sydney, like the same country. Yeah. But people who were born and raised in Sydney, they have their own agenda.
Yeah, and I had a friend who was Taiwanese who lived in London for 10 years. And he said, I had no English friends. After 10 years, I had no English friends. Everywhere you go, if you're in a big global city, locals will be doing their thing. And then you'll have foreigners who are coming in and out. And if you're a foreigner, you want to be understanding. You don't want to be like, oh, I have no interest in becoming friends with locals. But if you're like, why won't anyone hang out with me on Friday night? You have to be reasonable and be like, well, they have a busy life. They have lots of other people who are in their life they need to catch up with. Who are the people who also need friends? They're the other foreigners who just turned up. So, I think it's always good to be like, okay, a bit pragmatic. And so that's how I ended up, We have a group of Aussie friends who all came roughly similar time. A few came before me, a few came a bit after. And then, even then, we get busy. Now we used to catch up more frequently. Now we catch up once every few months.
Yeah. You guys live in a condo.
Yes.
You planning to move to HDB because your wife is Singaporean? I mean, you're married?
We're renting at the moment, but my wife had an apartment previously. We don't have a plan to live in HDB. We have lots of friends who live in HDB. And I think if you get an HDB in a nice location and you renovate it, particularly some of the older HDBs that have like nicer floor plans and you can knock out the walls, the newer ones, my wife tells me that the walls are all structural, so you cannot change the walls. But in some of the older ones, we have friends who they knock out a wall to make the living area bigger, and they newly renovate it when they get married. And they're very nice. One of the things I like about HDBs is that there's no security guard to harass all your visitors when they come in and out. There's no wall that you have to walk like the long way around 3 sides of the HDB to get to the MRT. Like generally HDBs, the access in and out is very good. It's very well looked after. So I like HDBs from that perspective. I don't like condos, the way they lock it up and they have a security guard and you have to go in and out through one gate. That's all a big pain. But I think for us, we do like having a little bit more space than the normal Singaporean home. We like being able to have family come and stay from Indonesia and Australia. That's not something that's so easy. I mean, some people have the jumbo HDBs, but they're very hard to find.
This thing about security guards and stuff and the walls, I was always curious. Singapore is so safe. Basically, why do you need this huge wall and why do you need security guards? Because in Singapore, it's freaking safe place.
I 100% agree with you. I think when I've said this to Singaporeans before, they will say it's safe because we do these things. But I think when you come from, most Western countries have more crime than Singapore does. And I've lived in other places. I lived in Istanbul in the past and I love Istanbul, but it's not always as safe as Singapore. Although actually it's much safer than most people outside of Turkey think. But yeah, I do think there's maybe a little bit of paranoia in Singapore about these things and maybe the people who buy in condos feel like they need that security guard checking who comes in and out. They know that like the wrong kind of people won't come in, and maybe it just helps them feel like, oh, you know, I'm special, I get to go past the security guard. To me, it feels like a waste of time and energy.
I would guess it's more like a status thing. So if you can afford condo, and then you kind of have this.
In this condo, we have the app, and sometimes you see like something will happen and someone will complain. And if you have security guards controlling who can come in and out, maybe it's easier for them to track down like who is it who did this thing, who, you know, whose dog it was it who left the dog poop on the footpath, or whatever the
Very
things
dangerous.
are that
Big crime, very dangerous.
whatever the things are that people complain about. But my friends who live in HDB, they don't have big problems. like, you know, they leave their shoes outside the door, no one steals them. Like nice shoes outside the front door, no one steals their shoes. You know, sometimes you read in motherships some not nice stories about disputes between neighbours, but I think the same things can happen in condos. I don't think the wall and the security guard help. I think they just make it a lot harder for anyone who wants to like walk to the MRT, or, you know, if you have a party and you invite 25 friends, then you spend the whole night like buzzing people in, and
Yeah.
it, you know, it makes life a bit of a nightmare and discourages you from being hospitable.
Yeah, true. Are you planning to stay in Singapore, or like you have different options?
We like it here in Singapore, and so my view is always like it has to be like a really strong reason to leave. And then on top of that, my wife is pregnant, so we're expecting a son next year. Our son will have to do national service. And I have friends who they were Singaporean and their parents took them overseas, and then they had to come back for national service. And that was very hard for them. Like, I think for some of my friends, it was like the worst time of their life. But I think if we stay in Singapore and our son goes through Singaporean school and all of his friends go to national service as well, it'll be a lot easier for him. So I think actually with kids, it's even more likely that we just stay settled in Singapore. It's a good place to stay. I think Singaporean schools are very good. And so, you know, we're very happy here.
Would your wife consider to move somewhere else and live somewhere else, being Singaporean?
My wife was actually looking to move somewhere else before she met me. And then I guess I anchored her back down here. So my wife would be very happy to live somewhere else.
Sometimes it's like we also feel like speaking with foreigners on this channel, speaking with foreigners who live in Singapore, like Singaporeans start to appreciate the country more because there's a different perspective from people from abroad. And they see, oh, now we understand, like our Singapore is actually a quite good place. You know?
Yeah, I think that's very true. Like, I think if you're a Singaporean, when you go and travel to like America or to Japan or to Australia, oftentimes you go to pretty nice places. Like maybe you just go to the tourist places, but even if you like have like cousins who live there or people who used to work with who live there, generally you're going to go to the nice places, you're going to stay in the nice areas. I think if you come from another country, you're more aware of the not nice places. I mean, I think one brilliant example is, I think a lot of Singaporeans, when they look at the education system, they'll be like, oh, NUS isn't as good as Harvard or Oxford. But you know what? NUS is much better than like 99% of the universities in the world. I think they will be like, oh, Singaporean schools, like, you know, they could be better in this area. The students, like, they learn too much by rote, they're not creative enough, you know, whatever reasons. And then you're like, you do realize that like in a lot of Western countries, if you are in like a school in the wrong neighborhood, half the kids might not have a father at home. And people are like, really? Is that possible? And so they don't necessarily realize that like when they think about like an Australian school, they're thinking about like a private school in a nice neighborhood that actually has like a very long waiting list and like, you know, is not, most Australians cannot send their children to that school. And actually I think like average Singaporean, actually below average. Like I always say, like if you were going to be born to parents who aren't wealthy, Singapore I think is a better place to be born to not wealthy Singaporeans than being born to like not wealthy Australians. Because in a place like Australia, where you grow up, what primary school you go to, what high school you can go to, has a big impact. Like I did law at Melbourne University and I came from a government school, but it was a school you had to do an exam to get into. So even to go to that school, your parents need to be like clued on enough to like send you to do the exam. And so like that sets like a certain level of motivation. There were large parts of Melbourne where like no one from those parts of Melbourne came and did law at our university because the schools in those areas like were nowhere near getting the scores that would like, if they got one student in like 5 years who got a score good enough to go to law school at Melbourne University, it was like a miracle. Whereas I think in Singapore, a lot of people will complain like, oh, we test the children too much, it's very stressful. But what that means is I have friends who are like bond traders in Western banks earning lots of money. And when you talk to them, they're like, yeah, when I started working and earning money, my parents quit. And you're like, oh, what did your parents do? Oh, they were like cleaners in a hawker center. You don't see that story. I mean, sometimes you hear it with like migrants in the West. There are always exceptional stories.
Yeah.
But like a really smart kid whose parents are like working as cleaners has to, like their parents have to be really motivated to get them up to the top in a country like Australia. Whereas I feel like in Singapore, it's a bit like if that kid gets good test scores, the system is naturally going to pull them along. Now, if you're a middle-class parent whose kid doesn't get quite such good test scores, that's a bit stressful because your kid is competing with kids who can test well, whose parents aren't as well off, and maybe it's hard to convert your money into advantages for your kid. But actually, like testing is really good if you're poor and you're smart. A test-based system works really well.
Yeah, that's amazing observations. Like we have this anecdote in Russian. It's like it ends with, don't confuse tourism and immigration. So it's completely two different things. Like as you mentioned, you go to a nice somewhere in the US or like in Europe. Like some people I talked to, some Singaporean friend, he's like, oh, I just went to a road trip in Europe. It was amazing. Like I just want to live in Europe. But it's like, man, if you're doing a road trip with your friends in Europe, it's one story. If you live there, if you move to European country and you like look for a job and you like try to settle down, it's different story.
I mean, my colleagues in London, no one lives closer than 1.5 hours from central London.
Yeah, true.
Most of them live like 2 hours away in Essex or out in the Chilterns, or one of them lives down near Brighton. And so during COVID, they cancelled the lease on the office in central London. And only in January next year are we reopening a central London office. We had people working in Essex, people working elsewhere, but like no one lived in central London. Like central London is for tourists and like rich Russians and Arabs and maybe like young people who are willing to like live in a really, really terrible place so that they can like have a fun lifestyle. But once you grow up a bit and you want to live in a place where there's not mold growing on the walls and like, you know, your neighbors aren't drug dealers, you move out of London because it's unaffordable otherwise. I think Singaporeans can't imagine like a 1.5 hour commute, like an office where everyone has a 1.5 hour commute. It's like unimaginable.
True. So when you come to Singapore, I know you were in the church.
The church that I go to now in Singapore is called The Crossing.
Yeah, and so it's Christian.
So it's a Protestant,
it's Protestant
church. Like a lot of churches in Singapore, real estate here is very expensive, so we don't have a building. So we rent space in a shopping mall at Lavender called Aperia. Basically, you have three stories of shops, and then above there are some office towers. We rent some meeting rooms kind of on the roof garden on Sundays. And so there's about, when I first came to Singapore, there was probably about 600, 700 people at that church, and now it's probably more like 1,300. So it's grown quite a lot since I got here.
What's the biggest difference how, let's say, Singaporeans approach the religion and approach the church versus foreigners?
I think one thing that kind of really surprised me, so one thing that I did was when I came here and I joined the church, I started going to a Bible study on a weeknight. And in Australia, when people go to like a Bible study, you'll have like a passage of scripture that you're studying for the night. And when people talk about it, they talk a lot about their own feelings, their own experiences. I remember like going through the study, then at one point, one of the Singaporeans in the study, this was when I was like very new in Singapore, maybe 2-3 months, she says, so what's the right answer? And I think reflecting, that's like a massive difference between like maybe the way that Westerners approach things, which can be a lot about our emotions and about us. And then actually, I'm not sure if it's the education system or the culture, but I think Singaporeans have a much stronger sense of like there is an objective truth. And actually what I think about this, what I feel about this is not as important as what is the correct what is the correct way to understand this scripture? There's actually something that's really interesting about that, and maybe that fits like when you think about Lee Kuan Yew and you think about like the way that Singapore has developed so much over the last 50, 60 years. A mindset which is less about like, this is how I feel, this is what I think, and more about what is the reality. I think that reflects a lot of Singapore.
Interesting. So I can understand if it's applied to, I don't know, like work or career or like, I don't know, science. But for religion, you have to believe, right? Or like the Singaporeans need explanation.
I guess the difference is, in my experience, and obviously like everyone is different, but in my experience, like it's very common in Singapore that when people come to a passage of scripture, they're like, what does this actually mean? Like what was the original intent? You know, as a Protestant, I think that's actually how you should read the Bible. And I think one of the things that as Westerners, we can be very like, oh, how can I use this to express my emotions, to express, to like, how can I relate it to my experiences? And there are aspects of both that are valuable. There's no point if you just read it to be like, okay, I want to know the truth of what this says, and then you think that it has nothing to do with your own life. But if you read it and you think that, actually, I cannot see past my own life, I cannot see that there's something in this that is bigger than me, then that also is very dangerous. So I think starting from that position of what is like, okay, I'm looking at this, it's bigger than me, what is the truth of what this says? That's a really interesting thing, and I think actually a very powerful thing that I've seen with Singaporeans, that as Westerners, maybe we're a bit too subjective.
Oh, you are so sweet. Thanks for watching the next video. Yeah, right here, this one. Thank you again and see you there.